Well, when my older brother and I were in our teenage years, if the TV was on in the morning at our house, it was typically on one thing. It was on SportsCenter on ESPN. We watched a whole lot of SportsCenter. If you're unfamiliar with it, it's a show that still airs today, and it gives you all the major sports news of the day, and it shows you the highlights from all the games the previous day as well. And one of the features that I love on SportsCenter, and they did it when I was a kid, and they still do it today, is the top 10 plays. And they'll give you, just the best highlights, the best plays from the previous day's games. So you'll see things like a baseball player robbing a home run, or you'll see a basketball player with a monster slam dunk, or you'll see a football player with a one-handed catch in the end zone to win the game. Those are the kind of plays that you will see on the top 10 plays. And as a kid, you would watch these and you would dream about maybe one day that you would make these kind of plays. And you'd go out in the backyard and you'd reenact it. And you thought, okay, maybe one day I'm going to be on SportsCenter. I'm going to be on the top 10 plays. Shockingly, it has not happened for me yet. But I'm still dreaming. Maybe there's still hope. So SportsCenter has another feature as well called the not top 10 plays. So you could probably guess what the not top 10 plays are. If the top 10 plays are the highlights, the not top 10 plays are the bloopers, right? So these are the blunders, the mess-ups, the failures, and they display them for all to see on SportsCenter. It's when people don't make the catch, but they drop the ball, whenever players run into each other, or a grounder rolls in between someone's legs. No one wants to be on the not top 10 playlist. This is not their aspiration. No kid is dreaming that one day I hope I make the not top 10 playlist. I want you to imagine with me for a second that somehow I could bring up on the screen behind me, I could display your top 10 plays of your life. And I'm not talking about your top 10 sports moments. Maybe some of you had some pretty cool sports moments, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about some of your greatest moments in life, some of your highlights. If I could show that on the screen behind me, that'd be kind of cool. It'd be neat to celebrate. What if I could put up there the top 10 plays of your faith, of your walk with Christ? What if those were displayed on the screen? Would you want to see that? Moments in life when you really trusted God and stepped out in faith in some way. Or moments in life when God used you in such a way to make an impact for his kingdom. Or when he used you to help someone else see Jesus. If you could watch those plays on the screen, that'd be interesting. Well, let's keep imagining. What if I could show your not top 10 plays of your faith on the screen? What if I could show those? Someone said no audibly. I don't know that would be appealing to us, to show our failures, our mess-ups, our mistakes, the moments when we lacked faith. Would you want to see that? Would you want others to see that? Probably most of us would be pretty embarrassed to have that shown. We don't want people to know our weaknesses and our mistakes. We would much rather people know about our top 10 plays than our not top 10 plays. Well, we're continuing the sermon series we've been in that Ken's been taking us through called Finding Jesus in Mark. We've been going through the Gospel of Mark, and this morning we're going to look at a story at the end of chapter 8 and a couple into chapter 9 as well. And out of the four Gospel writers, Mark, even more than the others, portrays the 12 disciples often in an unflattering light. He gives us some of their not top 10 plays. He shows us moments when they're slow to understand Jesus, or when they just don't get it, or when they're lacking in faith, despite all the incredible things they had seen Jesus do. So he shows them often in an unflattering light. We believe the writer of Mark is John Mark, who is a disciple, but he wasn't one of the 12. He shows up later in Acts. He's one of the companions of Paul. And I'm sure the 12 probably did not appreciate Mark including these details that makes them not look so good. It's like, well, did you have to include that in there, Mark? But it's interesting, church tradition has long held that one of Mark's main sources as he wrote these stories about Jesus was Peter. That it's believed that Peter, which would make sense, he's one of the 12. He would have been present, a firsthand witness for so many of these stories of Jesus. And so it makes sense that he would have been a source for Mark. And so that's really interesting. If Peter was a source for Mark, why would Peter share these details? Why would he share details with him that make himself or make the other disciples not look very good, or that displays their lack of faith at times, or displays their confusion? But yet Peter does share that with Mark, and Mark does write these down. Perhaps Peter was not concerned with making himself or the disciples look good. Maybe he was more concerned with letting others know how good Jesus is. And perhaps Peter knew that the Jesus followers that would later read these stories, including you and me, that maybe we have something to learn from their flaws and their failures and how Jesus responded to them. So we're going to look at these stories today. I think if we're honest, many of us can relate with the disciples, that we have times when we struggle with confusion, or when our faith is weak, or when we just don't get it. So if that's you, I think you'll connect with what we're talking about today. We're going to look at 3 stories, one at the end of chapter 8, 2 in chapter 9, and we're going to see some of the struggles of the disciples. And as we read these stories, we're going to see, what do they reveal to us about Jesus? What do they reveal to us about what it means to be his disciple? And what does it have to say to us that sometimes struggle in our faith? So let's turn to chapter 8, verse 31 to start. This story takes place after a really good moment for Peter. You could classify it as one of his top 10 plays where he demonstrated faith in Jesus. Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he asks them, he says, "Who do people say that I am?" And his disciples respond. They say, maybe some say John the Baptist, or they say Elijah or one of the prophets. And then he asks them directly, he says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter is the first one to speak up, which isn't rare for Peter. He likes to do that. Except many times that gets him into trouble. Right here he says something beautiful, though. That he confesses, he says, "You are the Messiah." That he understands who Jesus is in this moment. Well, after Peter's confession, Jesus then reveals to his disciples just what kind of Messiah he is going to be. So he describes it starting in 8:31. And this is something he's revealing to them that is new, that they did not understand before. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." So it starts out, it says, he began to teach. I think this indicates Jesus he's telling them something new at this point, something he hadn't told them before. He's revealing something that hadn't previously been revealed to them. And this kind of marks a turning point in the Gospel of Mark. Really, chapter 1 through 8 in Mark has really been about Jesus' authority and his kingship. It's been just showing us what he has authority over. That he has authority over sickness, he has authority over disability, he has authority over the demons, he has authority over nature and over weather. And so it's showing us just his kingship, his authority. Mark makes a change kind of here with this story, that the rest of the gospel is going to reveal to us, just kind of what kind of Messiah, what kind of king he is going to be. That he's going to be a king that suffers and that dies for us. And that's what Jesus tells the disciples right here. So in a sense, he's giving his job description as the Messiah to his disciples. But his job description that he gives them doesn't match the picture that they had for the Messiah. This is not what they thought the Messiah would do or what Jesus would do. He says, "I'm going to suffer. I'm going to be rejected. I'm going to be killed. and then rise 3 days later. And I'm sure, I don't even know that the disciples got to the point where they started to process the last part where he's going to rise 3 days later, because it seems like they're so hung up on the first part of, you're going to die? You're going to suffer? And they just couldn't comprehend that. How could that be? How could Jesus, this Messiah, how could he suffer and die? The one who they've seen calm the wind and the waves, right? The one they've seen feed 5,000. The one they've seen walk on water. Like, how could anyone kill you? How could you die? I don't understand that. Their job description for Jesus was that he would use the supernatural power that they've seen, and he would use it to free Israel from Rome, and he would ascend to the throne, and he would set up this earthly kingdom, much like the days of David that you read about back in the Old Testament. That's what they pictured for the Messiah. They couldn't understand how the path to becoming king and establishing his kingdom, that it would be through suffering and death. That didn't fit their picture. They couldn't understand that he came to free them from something much worse than Rome. So Peter, he speaks up again. He follows his top 10 moment with a not top 10 moment. It says he pulls Jesus aside, can you imagine that? And rebukes him. And the same word that's used for rebuke here is the word that is used when Jesus has earlier rebuked the demons. Think about that. Like the relationship Jesus has had with the demons, he's one who has authority over them. He silences them and does not let them talk, and he commands them to get out, and they are forced to obey. And now Peter's speaking to Jesus that way, that he is rebuking Jesus, as if Peter thinks he knows better than Jesus, or that he has a clearer picture of what it means to be the Messiah than Jesus. At this point, he just doesn't get it. The suffering and dying part, he can't comprehend. And Jesus answers Peter's rebuke with another rebuke. He says, "Get behind me, Satan." Man, I'm sure that was shocking to hear. It says that Jesus looks at his disciples and rebukes Peter. I think he's looking at his disciples because I think all of them were thinking the same thing. Peter's just the only one willing to speak up. I think for all of them, this didn't fit their picture of the Messiah, for him to suffer and die. And so Jesus rebukes Peter and rebukes them in this moment. And it's interesting, he brings up Satan here. We've seen Jesus tempted in the wilderness by Satan earlier. I think Jesus is making it clear that, in a sense, this is a temptation from Satan to accomplish his mission in any other way than the cross. But Jesus knows his mission, and he knows that the only way that he can save us is by going to his death. So Jesus tells the disciples, you don't get it. You have in mind human concerns, not the concerns of God. You're thinking in terms of kingdoms of this world, but I'm bringing a different kind of kingdom, an upside-down kingdom, but they just don't grasp it. They misunderstand his mission in this moment. Well, after giving them his job description, he now gives the job description of a disciple, of what it means to follow him. This starts in verse 34. Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels." So Jesus explains to the disciples not only that he will suffer and die, but that anyone that wants to be his disciples will follow in his footsteps. That he calls his disciples to deny themselves, to take up their cross, and follow him. This doesn't fit the pictures the disciples had for what it meant to follow Jesus. Later in chapter 9, at a story we're not going to look at, Jesus catches the disciples arguing with one another about who's the greatest among them. For them, they thought as they followed Jesus that it was a path to triumph and glory and honor as they followed Jesus to the throne. They did not realize that it included suffering and sacrifice and death. The disciples, they misunderstand discipleship. When Jesus tells them to take up their cross, their connotation of a cross would be different than our connotation. Obviously, we think of the cross and we think about what Jesus did for us at the cross. We think about his sacrifice, and it's become a beautiful thing to us. We may wear it as a necklace, or we may display it in our homes. But when they saw a cross, they had a very different feeling. If they saw someone carry a cross, they realized that's probably the last time they're seeing that person alive. For them, the cross, it was an instrument of death. So what does it mean that Jesus calls them to take up the cross? The call to deny yourself and take up your cross is a call of submission and surrender to the will of God. That he's calling them to put to death your will and your plans and your selfish desires and embrace the life that Jesus has for you. It's saying to God, God, my life is no longer mine, but it is fully yours. So self-denial, it's not about devaluing yourself or seeing yourself as something that's less valuable, but rather it's a shift in authority. It's realizing that your life doesn't belong to you, but you are giving it to God because it's his anyways, that you are living for Jesus, for his purposes. This isn't just the job description for the 12, but this is the job description for any of Jesus' disciples. This is my job description and your job description, that he calls us to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow him. That's what discipleship looks like, to trust him with everything, with our full lives. And he says, whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? I think Jesus gives them more insight into his mission as he starts talking about their soul. He's letting them know what are the stakes here, and it's about souls. That's what Jesus cares about. He cares about your soul, he cares about their soul, and that's why he came. That is his mission, is that he came to save souls. He's more than a miracle worker that they've seen. He's more than a healer. He's more than a weather controller. He's more than a food multiplier. The main purpose of Jesus as the Messiah is to rescue our souls and restore them to God, and he's going to do that through his death. So how can we save our soul, as Jesus talks about? How can you save your life? You trust Jesus with it. You surrender it to him. You make your life about living for him and his purposes, because he is the only one that can save our souls. If you're trying to save your life, if you're trying to make it the best possible life that you can, and you're pursuing things of this world and your own plans, he says ultimately you're going to lose it. But if you trust him with it, if you live for him, even though that path is hard, it means self-denial and suffering and sacrifice, but he says you will find life, true life in him. Well, let's look at the next story. Chapter 9, verses 2 through 10. In this story, we're going to see Jesus takes 3 of his disciples, and he takes them up on a mountain. And they're going to see Jesus in a way that they've never seen Jesus before on top of this mountain. So let's read it, 9, verse 2 through 10. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud, "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. So Mark tells us this event takes place 6 days later. So 6 days after their conversation where they're arguing with Jesus about him having to suffer and die, this event happens. And I would imagine that conversation was pretty rattling to the disciples. That for the idea that Jesus is going to suffer and die as the Messiah, that probably shook them. That they may have questioned, was I wrong about Jesus? Is he truly the Messiah? They maybe start dealing with some confusion and some questions and doubts at that point. But then Jesus takes 3 of them, what we often refer to as his inner circle, Peter, James, and John. And for some reason, he takes these three often and lets them experience things that the others don't get to experience. It seems like he invests more time in them. I don't know exactly why, but maybe it has something to do with the important role he's going to have for them in his church later on. But he takes those three up the mountain, and they see three amazing, mind-blowing sights on this mountain. First, they see Jesus transfigured or transformed. It says he's dazzling white, whiter than anything in the world. So Jesus gives them a visual glimpse into his full glory. That he's not just this carpenter from Nazareth, but he is the Son of God. So what they believed about Jesus and hoped about Jesus, they are now seeing it affirmed in front of their very eyes as he is shown in his glory before them. The second thing they see or experience is Elijah and Moses show up, and they start talking with Jesus. Elijah and Moses, who lived hundreds of years before Jesus ever come to the earth, and now they're here in front of them. These guys they probably heard about growing up in synagogue and heard stories from scriptures about Elijah and Moses, and now they're right there talking to Jesus. They can see them. I think that would be pretty mind-blowing. And I'm not sure how they know that it was Elijah and Moses. I don't think they had photographs back then. They couldn't pull up their Facebook profile pictures and be like, oh yeah, that's Elijah, that's Moses. Somehow God gave them insight that this is who this is. Moses, the one that led God's people out of Egypt, that God made his covenant with his people through, and that God gave his law to his people through. And then Elijah, this great prophet who stood up for God when many other people didn't. And so Moses, that represents the law of God, and Elijah, the prophets. And you think about the law and the prophets, that really is all the Old Testament. That was all of Scripture at that time, was the law and the prophets. So here we have the visual representation of the law and prophets all pointing to Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God. He's even greater than Elijah. He's even greater than Moses. You can imagine the disciples are amazed. They're awestruck at this point. Can you imagine seeing this, being there and experiencing this? Mark tells us they were frightened. And so Peter, he feels like he needs to say something. He just can't stay quiet. He can't keep his mouth shut at this point. He's got to speak up. Do y'all know anyone like that? They just have to speak up even when the moment's not appropriate to speak up. Some of us struggle with that. But Peter says, let me build some shelters. I'll build three of them, one for each of y'all. I'll build some shelters. I don't know why this is Peter's thought. Mark tells us he doesn't know what he was saying. Maybe it has something to do with a lot of times when you see someone have an experience with God in the Old Testament, to mark that experience afterwards, they would build something there, like an altar or some other structure to remember this experience. Maybe that's Peter's thinking. Maybe he just wanted this moment to last. Maybe he just thought, this is amazing. Let's build shelters. We'll just camp out here, and we'll just keep experiencing this mountaintop moment here and just make this last. And then the third amazing thing they see or experience, a cloud surrounds them, and the voice of God speaks. It said, "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." This is an understatement, but it's a big deal to hear the voice of God, right? That's something the disciples had not experienced at this point. We hear God's voice one other time in Mark at his baptism, and he says something very similar to this. I think that time it seems like it was maybe more for Jesus' benefit as he started his ministry, that God affirms him as a son whom he loves. I think this time the benefit seems to be for the disciples, that this voice speaks up to say, hey, this is him. This is my son. Listen to him. And that command to listen to him is so significant, because just 6 days before, the disciples were arguing with Jesus about saying, no, you can't suffer and die. But God's trying to tell them, look, this is my son. I'm revealing him to you. I'm showing you this is him. You may not understand the plan. You may not get it, but just listen to him. Just trust him. Well, after they experience this, suddenly Elijah and Moses, they're gone. The cloud's gone, and it's just them and Jesus again on the mountain. And as they go down the mountain, Jesus says, don't tell anyone about this until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. And I think that would be pretty hard to do not to tell anyone about this, especially for Peter. He can't keep his mouth shut. That would be really hard to do, to not talk about what they just experienced. And perhaps Jesus didn't want them talking about it, because even though they had seen his glory as the Messiah, they still were struggling to understand what kind of Messiah he was going to be. So maybe it wasn't time for them yet to share about the Messiah until they better understand just kind of what kind of Messiah he is. But he tells, wait till the Son of Man has risen from the dead. And that really puzzles them, because like to rise from the dead, you have to die first. And surely this one that they just saw dazzling white in glory, who was talking to Elijah and Moses, he's not going to die. How could he ever die if he is God's son? And so for them, that doesn't fit their picture still. So raising from the dead must mean something else. It must be metaphorical. So they're trying to figure it out as they're going down the mountain. So what do we learn from this story? What is Jesus doing in giving these disciples this glimpse of his glory? You know, it's amazing that it's right after the story where they misunderstand his mission. They misunderstand what it means to be a disciple. It's in the middle of their doubt and their confusion that Jesus gives them this affirmation of who he is, that they can trust in him. They can listen to him as the voice of God spoke on the mountain. They can listen to him as the Messiah, the Son of God. So even in their misunderstanding and their imperfect faith, Jesus continues to teach them, and he continues to reveal to them who he is. Well, let's look at one more story in chapter 9 that comes right after this story. In the section we're looking at today, the disciples, they're kind of riding a roller coaster on their faith journey. Peter has this awesome moment. He confesses Jesus as the Messiah, and then in the very next moment, he's getting rebuked by Jesus saying, "Get behind me, Satan." And then the three disciples get to experience this mountaintop experience, literally, where they see the glory of Jesus as the Son of God. And then they're going to come down the mountain, and we'll see the rest of the disciples are in a situation where they are struggling. They're lacking in their faith in this moment. So let's look at this story. So it's in Mark 9, 14 through 29. And maybe you can identify with that roller coaster on your faith journey. Maybe you have moments where you feel like you have moments where you're trusting in God and you're trying to follow him, but then you also have moments where you're struggling in your faith. Maybe you've been there before. Maybe you're there today. Maybe that seems pretty relatable to you. But in Mark 9, 14 through 29, we see Jesus and the three come down, and they find the rest of the disciples surrounded by a crowd, and people are arguing, and it turns out there's a man that has brought his son to the disciples, and his son suffers from a debilitating condition. He's possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of his speech and seems to give him seizures. And so picking up, I'll read starting in verse 17. A man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." "You unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It has often thrown him into fire or water to kill him, but if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." "If you can," said Jesus, "everything is possible for the one who believes." Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." When Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" He replied, "This kind can come out only by prayer." So this father comes desperate, hoping Jesus or his disciples can heal his son of this condition. And I feel like as we read the story, it's very natural to feel compassion for this father. If you can imagine having a child that's going through this kind of suffering. But the disciples are unable to heal him. Jesus is up on the mountain with the three, and these disciples can't heal him. You know, in the past, the disciples have been able to drive out spirits. We go back to Mark chapter 6, Jesus sends out the 12, and he sends them to preach the gospel, to heal people, and to drive out spirits. And it says in 6 verse 13, it says they were able to heal many people, and they were able to drive out spirits. But right here, for some reason, they could not drive out this spirit. And Jesus, he seems almost frustrated with his disciples and their lack of faith. And he says what sounds like really harsh words. And it's unclear if they're directed just at the disciples or if he's also speaking to the crowds and maybe the teachers of the law that were present. But he says, "You unbelieving generation, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you?" Even after all the miracles they've experienced of Jesus, they're still struggling with their faith. There's still moments where they're lacking. Jesus says, "How long shall I stay with you?" And yet he still stays with them. Jesus continues to be patient with them, and he continues to teach them and invite them to trust. At the end of the story, Jesus tells them this kind can only come out by prayer. It's interesting that the disciples never thought to pray in that moment. I feel like as it wasn't working, I think that would be a natural response. I think the disciples misunderstand something about dependence, spiritual dependence on God. And so Jesus, he's teaching them. He's trying to teach them to depend on God. But backing up in the story, the Father pleads with Jesus saying, "If you can do anything, take pity on us, help us." Jesus, he starts teaching this Father about faith as well. He says, "If you can, everything is possible for one who believes." Ken dealt with this back in April as we went through that series on healing, and he really wrestled with the tension so beautifully. And so one thing Jesus is not saying, he's not saying that if you have enough faith that God will always answer your request for healing. He's also saying that if God didn't answer your request for healing, that means you didn't have faith or you have a lack of faith. But I do want to be clear, Jesus certainly responds to faith. Throughout the gospel, there are times he heals people because of their faith. So we should come to God and request healing with faith. But we also know that you can have faith in God, you can have a strong faith, but God still chooses to heal at a time and in a way different than what you ask for. God is still God, and he's still sovereign. If you didn't get to hear those sermons back in April, I encourage you to go listen to those because Ken really wrestled with that beautifully. But the Father, he responds to Jesus with an honest statement that maybe you can relate to. He says, "I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief." And then Jesus heals the boy of the spirit that afflicted him. What do you think of the Father's statement? "I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief." I find it to be an incredibly honest portrayal of faith. As we see the disciples struggling with their faith in these passages, where they do believe in Jesus. They've left everything to follow him. But at the same time, they still deal with confusion and questions and doubts. I think this could be their plea. "I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief." Probably for many of us, this could be our plea. Can you relate to this? Like the disciples, we struggle with our faith. We believe, maybe you've committed your life to following Jesus, but at the same time, we still have weakness. We still have imperfect faith. I know I've prayed this prayer to God before. I know I've prayed this prayer this week to God. "I believe, help me overcome my unbelief." Maybe that needs to be your prayer this morning. Maybe that's where you're at. The beautiful things we see in these stories, and Jesus responds to this plea, that he does help us. He can help us when we don't get it, when our faith is struggling. Like with the disciples, he doesn't give up on us. He doesn't abandon us. He keeps teaching. He keeps revealing himself to us. Even in our confusion and our imperfect faith, Jesus continually invites us to deeper trust. Like the voice of God on the mountain, "This is my son, listen to him." So as we read about the disciples and their flawed faith, if you can relate, if that's what you're feeling right now, Jesus' invitation's for you as well. That he invites you to trust him. He calls you to deeper faith, deeper dependence on him, deeper surrender, to take up our cross and follow him. See, the truth is that our faith journey is not about our highlights or our bloopers, but it's about Jesus and how good that he is. So let's draw close to him. As he is God's son, let's listen to him, and he can help us overcome our unbelief.